Together, we can create a future where every childhood is healthy, safe, and resilient, free from trauma and adversity. That is the work we're committed to. Today, children endure epidemic rates of adverse childhood experiences, often leading to trauma. If childhood trauma was a virus, the governors would have shut down entire states and called out the National Guard to stop its spread. What kind of society allows an epidemic of childhood trauma to continue? We are a society awash in trauma. We are a nation of 50 states, each with its own level of trauma. Each state has its own unique history, telling the story of how children are protected or left vulnerable in traumatizing households, schools, and communities. Our mass media, social media, and entertainment industry spread toxicity and promote violence instead of real-world solutions to crises and trauma. We all travel through a traumatized and traumatizing society where untreated trauma and all the problems associated with it are the norm. This story is about ending the epidemic of trauma. It is about the root causes of adverse childhood experiences. You are being asked to think very differently about what you've been told about trauma and the real causes and solutions. Adverse childhood experiences and trauma exist in households of all income levels. It is not a problem to brush aside by thinking it's only happening on the other side of town. Because trauma is everywhere, its prevention must be system-wide, with strategies that create safe and healthy households, communities, schools, towns, cities, and counties. We have been, up until now, a society that has had a policy of apathy directed at childhood trauma and all its very costly consequences. The epidemic of childhood trauma is not the result of an uncontrollable act of nature. It's a man-made problem that can be solved with human compassion, innovation, and courage. We've seen how we mobilize to end a public health crisis deemed a priority. Today, you can join us in a new priority, ending the epidemic of childhood trauma. The 100% community model provides you and your community with the framework for creating trauma-free childhoods that lead to a society where 100% can thrive.
Hello and welcome to the Rural Impact, a very special 100% community live event. And I can promise you it's our first of many you can expect in the coming weeks and months. I'm Michelle Rathman, and I want to express my profound gratitude, and I mean that, for all of you joining us here today. But before I bring in our guests, our presenters of this program, I want to share with you just a bit of background, and it really is the why, if you will. Now, if you're a regular listener of our podcast, you know that we believe that the road to a quality of life is truly paved by policy. And this means access to healthcare services, including mental and behavioral health, food, housing, transportation, and education, and so much more, relies heavily, almost wholly, on funding made possible by policy. And while so much of the media today is consumed by federal policy and federal politics, we also know that if those funds don't make it to states, or states don't allocate those funds to our counties, the impact to families in your communities, the ones that you serve, they can be devastating. And by the same token, when your county is well-resourced, the communities and agencies you serve, they thrive. So today's special session is focused on that. That video was very powerful, but things are going to go uphill from here because we're going to be talking about thriving. And to help us understand how thriving can happen and is happening in New Mexico, it is my honor to introduce to you Dr. Katherine Ortega Courtney and Dominic Cappello, the authors of 100% Community, Ensuring 10 Vital Services for Surviving and Thriving. Dominic and Katherine, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you for having us. We're excited to be here.
All right, so we've got a lot to talk about, and I'm done talking for now because this is a power hour. We're going to use our time very wisely, and we're going to pull up a PowerPoint here, and you're going to teach us, as I've been calling it, a master class on how we reach that point. So, Katherine, I think we're going to go ahead, and our producer, back of the scene, Sarah, you're going to get up that PowerPoint slide. And you can explain to us how those of us who've joined us today can really start to take hold of this information and make something happen really special in their own communities.
So we are going to take what we call the road to 100%, and you'll understand what that means in a little bit by the end of this presentation. But I'm going to take us back to where we started. On the next slide, you will see all of our books. So we're going to start with Anna, age 8. And Dom and I are here today because we met over 10 years ago while we were both working for child welfare in the state of New Mexico. I was the bureau chief of the Research Assessment and Data Bureau, and it was my job to kind of take data and give management recommendations on what we should do. But at the same time, I was also charged with implementing a continuous quality improvement process throughout the whole agency. And so what I took that to mean was teaching people how to use data to make decisions. So Dom and I started this program called Striving Towards Excellence. It was what we called a data leaders program in child welfare. And so basically we were taking county managers from all over the state, teaching them how to understand their data, what that means, what this means for the kids in their system and the families in their system. And it was a very successful program. People were starting to try new things, and based on the data we were getting back, those things were working a lot of the time. So, but what we saw consistently was the county managers, the field workers would come in with stories of families who came in who are not yet at crisis level. So, they were struggling maybe to access housing or food, or maybe with some behavioral health issues, but they weren't at the level where child welfare would intervene, which really child welfare's job is to take kids, and make sure they're safe. So if they're unsafe in the home, they take them into foster care. Most of the families who get on the radar of child welfare are not at that level. They don't need their kids taken away. What they need is some sort of support. What we saw while we were working in child welfare was there was not that kind of support. So there was nothing anybody could do. Families were sort of struggling, not yet in crisis, not yet at the level of abuse, but needed help. And there was no system in place to help them. So, we kept kind of coming back to this idea that we need a way to truly connect families to services before they are in crisis. So while all of this was going on, there was a fatality while we were working there. It was a horrible case. Back then, these things were pretty rare. So it was one of the first ones that really kind of caught the news cycle, got under the attention of a lot of lawmakers. And this became the case that Anna, age 8, sort of became based on. Anna is a fictional character based on real things we saw while we were in child welfare. So she's sort of a composite. But while we were there was a child fatality. This child had been on the radar of child welfare their entire life. The mother had had previous involvement with child welfare even before this child was born. This kid spent her life in and out of services, in and out of foster care until she was 8 years old, where she had been returned finally the 8th time after being in foster care to her mother at the age of 8 years old, where she was kicked to death. And as you can imagine, this was a horrible thing to witness, a horrible thing to see. And there was a lot of outcry to make changes to the child welfare system. We can do better. We all agreed this should not happen. But what we saw was the response was not in a way that was going to help. We saw some sort of shoot from the hip ideas. Let's make punishment stronger for the parents and things like that, that were not going to get to the root cause of the issues. So Dom and I started researching, what could actually be done? What have other states done? What can we learn that can prevent something like this from happening again? And what we found was really two kind of root causes that we really tried to bring to the attention of people in Anna, age 8. So the two things were the child welfare system was not data-driven. It wasn't following a continuous quality improvement process. There was no way to kind of make sure that what they were trying to do was working. And the second thing was going back to that system of support. There was no way to support families when they needed help initially. It was kind of like we had to wait for them to get into crisis so that we could take their kids into foster care. And obviously, this is not an ideal system. So we published Anna, age 8, almost 6 years ago at this point. And what we found was it really resonated with people in communities, people who cared, people who knew the system. So we had book clubs starting to form saying, we want more. How do we do this? How do we implement the solutions that you are talking about? And so we published 100% Community, which is really the manual to kind of guide communities through that. And I'm excited to say that as of today, we have a new book called The 100% Community Model, which is sort of a composite of everything we've learned over the last 5 years of doing this work to guide communities in this process. And that is officially launching today. So we are really excited to be able to do that with you here today. So on the next slide, just to kind of go back a little bit to talk about what exactly you're going to find in this book, 100% Community Model. We started with adverse childhood experiences. So as we were going through the child welfare system and learning about why do families end up here, how do they end up in crisis to this point, we revisited the adverse childhood experiences study, which came out in the 90s. So basically, some researchers at Kaiser Permanente had their hands on a whole bunch of data, and they were able to ask adults, which of these things happened to you as a child? So you can see those 10 adverse childhood experiences on your screen. These are 10 things that happen in childhood that they found had relationships with things that happen in adulthood. So if you go to the next slide, you will see the consequences of adverse childhood experiences that they found. And these are just some of them. So the question that we had was, if we know that these things lead to these consequences, which are basically every public health challenge we were struggling with in New Mexico and that we see nationally, substance use, crime, domestic violence, job insecurity, health, physical health problems, mental health problems, why aren't we trying to prevent adverse childhood experiences? So we really became passionate about creating a model that could actually prevent adverse childhood experiences before they happen, because we know that once people fall into that cycle of trauma, it's really hard to get out. And it, again, leads to all of the things that we're trying to prevent as a society. So we developed the 100% Community Model initially to address the challenges of adverse childhood experiences, but they are also exactly what we need to do to address another huge issue in our society, which is called the social determinants of health. And I'm going to turn it over to Dom to let him tell you about that.
Thank you. So the term, the social determinants of health, and I think we can go to the next slide. It's not a term that's used widely with the public, even with lawmakers, even in public health where I used to work. But it's research. It represents research that's been around at least half a century. The social determinants of health mean the environments and the services that determine our health, our safety, our education, and our overall quality of life. You could call them the drivers of health, the drivers of safety, the drivers of having a good economy. And for us, as we looked at the research, and as Katherine is saying, our work got much bigger than child welfare. It's suddenly we were in the realms of public health, public education, higher education, the Attorney General's office, all of these entities working to serve the public. But it came back to 10 vital services. Now, we know there are 1,000 services that could enhance all of our lives. But if we get these 10 services in place in every county in the United States, then we have a new society. We have a society that says we value every infant, every child, every student, every parent, every caregiving grandparent, everyone, essentially. And these services are services you're all familiar with. And we divided them up. When we first presented the model to lawmakers here in New Mexico, we realized we had to kind of simplify it. So we talked about the 5 services for surviving. So these are the services for surviving the week. If a family does not have these services, there's got to be a lot of problems. So we're talking about medical care, behavioral health care, food security programs, housing security programs, and transportation to vital services. As we were surveying our parents to ask them about access to services, transportation came up all the time. Without some kind of transportation in rural America, people can't get to services. There is good news here, by the way. There are solutions for every problem you're going to hear about on this podcast. But the bottom line is we haven't invented those systems yet in this country. But the 5 services for surviving need to be in place in every county. And we know how to do that. We also like to move to the topic of thriving, as Michelle says. We want to talk about thriving. We're excited about that. But if you're not surviving, you're not getting to thriving. So we need to talk about parent supports, early childhood learning programs, fully resourced community schools, which mean schools that have school-based health centers and service hubs, family resource centers. So there's a lot to talk about with the schools. We'll get to that. But the last two sectors in our vital services for thriving would be mentorship and job training, because we all need jobs. And people in this ever-changing society, we need a lot of training in rural and urban America. So these are the 10 vital services. You're going to hear this over and over and over. And at the end of the day, though we are bombarded by thousands of policies and programs, can we just get back to 10 vital services? If your people have that, they're going to do really well. Next slide. And I'll go pretty quick here. It sounds like our initiative and our model has 3,000 moving parts, and in many ways it does. But at the end of the day, they're just 7 steps, 7 simple steps. And we just start with a survey. Every county can survey and ask their family members, can you get to these 10 vital services? If you can't get to them, why not? What are the barriers? So we went right to moms, right to dads, right to grandparents, right in some counties, right to youth, and said, what are you struggling with and why? This is where we have to start. We are a data-driven strategy. We need to know where we're at in every county and in every community within a county. So this is your first step. Next slide. And as you can see, I know probably it's tough to read some of this small print, but we're happy to send you samples of these county surveys, but you'll see that, or you can see that in all 10 sectors, we're learning, do you need the service? If you do need it, can you get to it? If you can't get to it, why can't you get to it? So again, 10 vital services. We gather so much wonderful data, and the data drives each county initiative. And you'll hear Katherine and I talk a lot about county, county, county. We're stressing that we're not here to save the world. We're not here to save the nation. We're not even here to save the state. We believe in a county model. A county model is something that we can wrap our hands around. Stakeholders working with county government, city governments, school governments, and yes, with support of the state and the feds. But think about the county as a country. Can that county become self-sufficient and take care of its people? Next slide, please. And again, we'll send you copies of this so you can see sector by sector. And I know it's tiny print, but you can see what are the barriers, and it won't come as a surprise to anyone on this call. Cost. People don't qualify. No transportation. Unsure about going. Not sure where the service is. Unfriendly hours. We have to stress that, governments and non-governmental organizations mostly work 9 to 5, and that's when working parents are not available to get to those services. So we have to rethink when are these services available? Evenings and weekends. So that mom working full-time at a motel who can't take breaks during the day, she knows where to go. All right, next slide. All right, we'll stress this a lot. You know, Katherine and I have a combined, oh my gosh, I was going to say, we have about 100 years worth of experience here, and we can tell you working with government that most of what's been done in the last few decades, and there are wonderful exceptions, but a lot of what's been done is not data-driven. It's based on hunches and thinking of what we've been doing in the past, or maybe, you know, a governor's nephew has an idea. That has not worked out so well. We will always stress that we move through continuous quality improvement. This means our county initiatives are working in that process to develop projects. And we, as a state, as the state entity overseeing it, we use this. So again, we assess, we plan, we act, and we evaluate everything, every component of this initiative. So this is really important to us. And this is how we get to results, because we evaluate. And if things aren't working, then we adjust. Next slide. This is where I think I'm going to hand it over to Katherine. I do want to say that, you know, we are the Anna Age 8 Institute. We were supported 5 years ago by state government to become a technical assistance center. And we thought we would only have 3 counties to start with. We thought 3 was plenty. If we're going to, as they say in public health, transform the adverse social determinants of health into the positive determinants, that's heavy lifting. Now, we have a process for it, and we feel good about it. We thought 3 counties were plenty. Once we put out the word that we were doing this, we now have 18, and there are more knocking on our doors. So when you think about this initiative, you can pilot in 1 county, you can go with 3, but just know that the need is huge, and people are going to reach out and say, what are you doing? How do you do it? How do you fund it? What do we need to get started? And Katherine and I can both talk to you about how easy it is to start this initiative.
Yeah, and I just want to add, we don't recruit counties into 100% New Mexico. This is completely a grassroots movement. So counties approach us and ask, how do we get started? And that's an important element. It really has to be locally driven. And the will inside the local communities has to be there. And that's not something we lack for. People are passionate about, changing their own communities for the better.
Thank you. So I just, I'm taking over from here, you guys, and I want to encourage everyone to please put your questions in the chat box. I have been working with Dom and Katherine for the better part of 3 years. And for people who have heard our previous conversation, they know that we came to know each other during the pandemic. And there was a bit of a panic mode on my part, wondering how families were going to be able to overcome things like, supply chain, food shortages in their communities and transportation barriers and things of that nature. But one of the number one questions I get asked is, how do we fund this? And Dom, you touched on that just a little bit. So if you could share with us, Dom,
sure,
a little bit about how it was funded in New Mexico, and then maybe we can share some insight into some other conversations we've had about if the funds that you received weren't available, where might someone go to access those funds, especially at a county level?
Sure. Well, what I want to say first is starting this initiative just starts with an Anna Age 8 book club. Mm-hmm. So the good news is that's pretty low cost. As a matter of fact, you're all getting a copy of Anna Age 8. So you can start the process for free. Now, we know if we're talking about building infrastructure in 10 service sectors, that is heavy lifting, and that requires money. Now, there's good news here. The issue isn't, do we have the money? We're in a nation with trillions of dollars. States, even our state, considered a poor state, we have billions of dollars. And even our smallest counties with their city governments have millions of dollars. So the question isn't, do we have the money? The answer is, of course we do. We have more money than we know what to do with. The question is, do we have the priority? That's where we have to start. And in terms of having conversations with City Hall, with your mayor, your city councilors, your county commissioners, they're sitting on millions and millions of dollars. It's all there. The priority isn't there, but that's changing with our initiative. What's interesting is some of our initiative members ran for office and became mayors and city councilors and county commissioners and school board members. So we've been at this for 5 years. We're watching a whole transformation here. But I want to say that, our state government, that means having a relationship with your state senators and your representatives. They're sitting on billions and billions of dollars. And so the journey is very interesting. And again, I know it shifts the conversation when you move from do we have the money to do we have the priority? It's a very different conversation when you're presenting. But of course, there is the federal government is out there, and that's another journey. Though we really like to talk to our counties about, our state can take care of us if that's the priority. And of course, there is philanthropy, and we've had some of our counties, and we encourage our counties to develop their own development plan, and we certainly support them with technical assistance. But there are a lot of foundations who are now, especially now after the pandemic, understanding the social determinants of health, the drivers of health. They want to move into something substantial. And so we have done a lot of research in who funds this work, and we'd be happy to share that with you down the road. So again, it's not a lack of money, but it has been a lack of vision. I think there's good news here when you start bringing people together. And I'd like to add that 5 years ago, when Katherine and I started this, at the yearly legislative session, all of you are aware of what your state does. You did not hear terms like social determinants of health or 10 vital services for surviving and thriving, or even adverse childhood experiences. But we can tell you, our session just ended. These are terms that are used daily now because we put out the books and we put out the book clubs and we put out mural projects. I mean, we have a whole other plan of how you get the message out.
I had a really interesting conversation. If you've listened to the previous episodes with Senator Souls, who is really responsible for making sure that it was put in front of the entire New Mexico legislation. And I think what was interesting is that he really put it into the context of a childhood Bill of Rights. And for those of you who are joining us today, it was a real aha moment for me because working in the healthcare sector, we've got these silos that we work in. And I love the concept that everything that you're talking about is woven into everything that we do. And one thing I want to mention, the book club we know is a first step. That's kind of a no-brainer, if you will. But let's just talk about conducting the survey for a moment. Because for anyone listening to this or watching this later on when we put it up on YouTube, we know that many organizations within a county are involved with conducting what we call a community health needs assessment. And that is where to identify like the big health problems, if you will. Talk to us a little bit about your survey and how it's different and maybe some insight as to how your surveys are conducted and the conclusions that you reach that you can't find within a community health needs assessment. I think that's an important thing to discern.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So what we found in New Mexico is most of our community needs assessments were based on provider data or observations from people who were in government or maybe working for nonprofits. What was missing was the voice of the people who actually needed the services, I'm sorry. So what we did was we relied on the wisdom of the community members. And so they were able to go out to the places where they knew people were. So depending on the community, they go to different places. And we partner with an agency within New Mexico State University called the Center for Community Analysis. So they have the sort of number crunchers who can give us kind of targets. So, you need this many people from this community to be somewhat representative. We do our best to make sure the people who answer are reflective of the community as far as demographics. But what I think is super important about our survey is that it's done by the community for the community. So it's driven by local community members who know where to find people, who know where people go, to ask the people who don't usually get asked how their access to services are. So what we found is the data is incredibly important. It's a great starting point to dive deeper. And we really do think of it as a starting point. So we get an idea of what the barriers are. And then really it's up to, again, the local community to figure out what does that mean when people say they can't access this service because of transportation? You know, where are they trying to go? And the great thing about this model is the community knows. We know that the communities know themselves better than some outside entity coming in and trying to, you know, help explain that to them. So it's very much community driven. It's really been an exciting thing to see unfold how different communities go about doing it. So some of them go to, you know, local medical clinics. Some of them go to laundromats, grocery stores, football games, wherever people go who need services, but don't typically get asked about their access to services. So that's...
You're right. Because local, health organizations, they ask a few questions when someone is seen in primary care, and primarily the question is, do you have enough food to eat, or are you worried that you won't have enough food, for the rest of the month? But we're not dialing into those details. And what I'm really excited about this is that when you have a community health needs assessment, and you can see that you have high incidence of fill in the blank, your survey then connects the dots to the gap in the service. And I think that's a really important point to make. We have a question someone asked, can anyone in the community, can anyone start a book club and then get the ball rolling? Or does it have to be somebody at a county or city level?
Gosh, that's a fantastic question. Anyone can start a book club. Change agents start... They come from everywhere. And I think just getting the conversation going. So just gather up 4 friends and just, over a few weeks, you can do it by Zoom. You can meet in a cafe. We have found that every county that had an Anna Age 8 book club ended with saying, we want to start the initiative. There is something about that story. And it's a very simple read. It's easy. I mean, it's difficult because of the topic, but there's also hope in that book. And I want to stress that we did not know that it would have the power that it did. I mean, this is the movement started by the story of Anna. So anyone can start it, and you'll just find that this process, it's an iterative process. It takes on a life of its own. And a state could have 4 different book clubs going. And in Taos County, it was started by the Taos Pueblo, who wanted to start it, had the book club within the Pueblo, then said, our services come from outside the Pueblo. So we need to engage the county and the city. At one point, they had 4 different book clubs going, and they're still reading and talking. So it's a really interesting experience. So yes, anyone can start. You can start it next week.
Now, let's talk a little bit about kind of after the fact. So we've done our book club, we've got our survey, and I think it's important for those who are joining us today to kind of get on the other side and understand. So you identify the gaps. Talk about some of what you've seen in New Mexico to address early childhood development. I mean, we know we would be really, I think, irresponsible to not kind of put this out on the table. We're seeing the defunding of these programs. We know in rural in particular, there is such a gap. I mean, it's not just child care. It's not just like having a babysitter. It's the development piece that we're missing. So I wonder if you could share with us the things that you're seeing that are happening as a result of doing that legwork, of what a couple of communities are doing to not only close the gap, but to develop a program that's enriching and sustainable. And same thing with youth mentoring and job training. What are some of the things that you're seeing that excite you, that are actually making change happen for communities that, were it not for this initiative, would be back to where they were, or maybe further behind?
We're really lucky in New Mexico. I think we're one of the leaders in the nation as far as early childhood. The same year the Institute got started the NA-Jade Institute, New Mexico also started a Department of Early Childhood Development and Services. So those two things happened at the same time. What was really exciting was to see some of the counties that already had existing early childhood coalitions now come together and join forces with the other 10 sectors, because what they understood already, but what we really put out there in the model is that these services are intertwined, right? So you can have childcare, but if you don't have transportation to get to childcare, that's not going to be helpful. Mm-hmm. Or, you can have Head Start programs, but, they also need support in food pantries and housing, as well as just, those early childhood education programs. So what we're seeing is this beautiful sort of melding in some communities. San Juan County is a great example here in New Mexico that had really strong early childhood coalitions that are now joining with the other 10 sectors to really create a full network of the 10 vital services in their county. So one of the strengths, I think, of this model is we can leverage existing strengths in the community and then join them together, teach the other sectors such that it is on how to do this, how to build a coalition, how to fill the gaps, how to network with each other. Because another thing that we saw early on is that these sectors don't talk to each other very often. So even just getting the 10 sectors in a room together can be a very powerful way to start off the initiative. Just like, oh, hey, you're in charge of food and I'm in charge of housing. Let's talk and see how our services connect with each other. Because again, they're all just very, very intertwined, although they're not set up to be intertwined as a system.
Right.
I think it's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess I'd like to add that for those listening, anyone can start a book club, and you get your first book club just to start the conversation. Then you can be strategic in the next book club, which is let's get representatives from the 10 sectors in the same cafe at the same time or the same Zoom call. And as Katherine said, it's amazing that these people are never in the same room, yet they, it's imperative that they are. We live in a world where everyone is siloed. And I think that the opportunity here with the model is you're going to get people out of their silos. And innovation happens when people come together. We're living in an era with artificial intelligence, AI. All of us right now could go to ChatGPT or Perplexity. I could type in right now, what are the most effective strategies for early childhood learning programs? And I would have a list this big. And I go, what's the research behind that? We don't lack the solutions. They are literally sitting on our desktop, on our mobile device. AI, it's here. We're missing the human connection. So from book club to 10 people in a room talking, to understanding how to use technology, how to bring in innovation, and again, then talking to our lawmakers. What might seem like an overwhelming experience is actually 7 simple steps of the initiative that we outline in our books.
Mm-hmm. There is no doubt. I mean, I've been to party on a couple of your listservs for Chaves County and San Miguel County, and what I've seen has been pretty remarkable, folks. I mean, there's like 100 people. Not that everyone wants a bunch of emails, but there's 100 people on emails on a listserv, and there's Saturday morning breakfast, clubs where they're talking about it. And what may seem so daunting to get started, when you share the lift, it's not so heavy. And that's what's been so exciting to me, but a little bit frustrating because it feels like people are having a hard time kickstarting it. But let's talk a little bit about the data that you're collecting after the fact, because it's one thing to say, we're here now, right? We've done the book club, we've done the survey, we've got the action teams together, and now let's talk about to the point where you are now analyzing, starting to get some data in to see the impact, appropriately so, of how that work is changing the landscape for the communities and the counties that you're serving.
What's really interesting, we had a conversation on Monday. We had to kind of have one of our very trusted colleagues tell us, you guys have done a lot. We were like, we don't have family centers yet. We don't have full 100% access to services. And she said, what I'm seeing as an external person here in New Mexico is quite remarkable. And so she reminded us that we have actually full evaluations, and we can share that page when we send out the email. We've partnered with Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago since the beginning of the Institute, and they've assessed the collective impact piece. So, those pillars of collective impact of having a shared mission, a shared vision, a shared data system. And what we found is really 100% New Mexico has done a remarkable job of bringing people together with a common vision. And that in itself, I've been part of many collective impact initiatives over the years. And this one is much stronger and more powerful. And I really, truly believe that the reason for that is because it is community driven. It's mobilized by people who truly care. And I think it's a vision that's so simple, 100% of people can access 10 vital services, period, the end. But it's also audacious, but yet it's tangible. It's something that we can all agree should happen. And so getting that, people on the same page that this is what we're working toward as a community is really powerful. And we have, data that shows that this initiative is doing a good job of doing that. Now, we also have a ton of data on what the barriers to the services are. And we're getting ready to release some publications on that at the statewide level for New Mexico. Of course, identifying the barriers is step one, and then addressing them comes next. And that's a longer term solution, but it's also something we're making progress on, which is really exciting.
Yeah. Here's a question, you guys. Oh, go ahead, Dom.
No, I was just going to say that. I mean, I love your question, and we're asked this all the time, which is, what can we measure? Are we moving the needle? And so I do want to go back to those 7 steps that we measure quarterly. So our evaluators are talking to every county. So in terms of the steps, have you done your first countywide assessment? Yes, they have. That's huge. That's really, really big. That's a big step. Have you gathered together with colleagues from higher ed to analyze the data? That's a whole other process. Sitting down, analyzing, look at these barriers. In behavioral healthcare, there are 7 barriers. They each have their own unique challenges, their own unique solutions. Now, that's a process that doesn't happen in a week or 2, but that's happening. Then are you talking, and this is all, remember, this is all within a county. Are you talking to your service providers in 10 sectors? Are you asking them, what are your challenges meeting local needs?
Do you have the 10 sectors?
Do you have? Yeah. Well,
that's a really important question.
We have counties that do not have the 10 sectors. And so, but getting back to what can we measure? We can measure the initial assessment. We can measure data analysis. We can measure them making priorities. We can measure reaching out to your local providers. We can measure, do you have an online directory to family services? Now, you would think in 2024, when AI is designing books and movies, that we could do that. Well, we have the technology to do it, but we have counties that don't have a directory, which means families don't know where to go and providers don't know how to refer. So can we measure which counties were able to make directories? And yes, we can. We have directories in half of our counties. Moving from there, it's, can you identify the evidence-based solutions? And one thing that we've been looking at is what we call the 100% community one-stop service hub. Because should a mom who worked all day at the motel and goes home exhausted, does she now have to drive to 20 different agencies to get help? Even if they existed, would they even be open? Can we put all these services in one place? That's not a new idea, but it's an idea we need to bring back. Every county requires a central location, and I want to stress that we can provide services on site online and through navigators. And what's different about our family center or our community center is that we're not just linking people to existing services. We have the staff to do quality improvement. They're the people who can take on a lot of this work, right? They can grow services because everyone on this call knows that we lack healthcare providers. We lack teachers. We lack social workers. Well, who's going to grow those in a county? Who's going to say, are our high school students going into these fields? And will they stay in our community and serve? These are the things a 100% family center can do. And also because we have the infrastructure of schools, they can also become service hubs. So we already have the models. And so when you ask us, what are our counties doing? We now have 15 proposals for 100% family centers, some of them school-based and some of them community-based. And these proposals are in the hands of foundations, state government, local government, and 3 of our counties are like moving out the door in their development. So that's another conversation.
And dare I say, I do think that federally qualified health clinics, I think that rural hospitals are also well positioned. It's interesting. I go to a lot of rural county websites in the work that I'm doing, and it's so interesting. I see, and this is not a knock on county websites, but I see access to public services and how to pay your water bill and things like that. But where is the directory? So I think that's a great idea. I have another question for you guys. Does 100% community model address healing trauma once it's caused? You mentioned that once trauma visits a person's life, it is hard to come out of that. But is there a model for that scenario in your books?
Yes, absolutely. So actually our book that came out last year, David, Age 14, talks a lot about that. So we talked about Anna. David is another fictional child based on real kids we know who survived past the age of 8, but struggled with trauma his whole life. And we kind of talk about how all of the systems that should have helped him as well failed him too. And then we talk about, what would have happened if these services had been in place. And, it's just so happens that the same services, the same network of social determinants of health that prevent trauma are also the same ones that help mitigate trauma. So again, access to behavioral health, stable housing, all of those things are what are needed to heal trauma as well as prevent trauma. So we talk about, David's mom and his family and what it could look like if those services were different and what kind of impact that could have had on his life if he could have accessed those services younger. So, we don't talk specifically about healing yourself or anything like that. There are a ton of people who do that. But what we talk about is sort of the society's structures and how, if these systems were in place, how that might look different as far as both preventing and healing trauma.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just wanted to add that, trauma-informed care is something we believe in, a trauma-informed philosophy that every provider, every agency, every school should have that understanding because we are navigating a very traumatized society. But as Katherine said, trauma-informed care is happening after the trauma occurs, and it's very important. But if you don't have these 10 services in place, we never end the cycle of trauma. So you really have to be doing all these things. You have to have the right philosophy, the right vision. And I think by reading Anna, age 8, and David, age 14, you're going to get a real understanding of how you transform all your agencies. But as Michelle said, there are places that don't have agencies, and there are schools that are barely surviving themselves. They don't have behavioral health care. Kids are sitting there with ACEs scores. You can take an ACEs survey of asking you 10 questions about which ACEs did you experience. We have students with 10 ACEs, 9 ACEs, 8 ACEs, and there's no behavioral health care in the school. And there's no help for that student. There's no help for that mom, for that dad, for that foster parent. So again, at the end of the day, you've got to get these services in place. Then we can have a trauma-informed society. That's how this works.
I think, obviously we can all say it's a matter of whether it's a priority. I also think that it takes a lot of courage. I think it takes a lot of courage for a community, for a county to address it head on, to have these open, courageous conversations. It's not a dig against any particular county or a county official or a city official. It's a matter of saying we have to shift our priorities a bit to recognize that if we're going to put on our websites, this is a great place to live, or we've got beautiful trees and beautiful parks, that's the exterior. And so when we take a look at where we're headed now in the year of 2024, and we look at the depletion of some of these services, it is a matter of having kind of turning our guts inside out and putting our hearts out there and saying, as a community, it is a priority to make sure that every child and family has the resources they need, and what role can I play in making that happen? I do want to share with everyone, we have one more quick video to share with you, but I have been working with Dom and Katherine. Everything that we're doing here has been a labor of love. Haven't received a single penny from doing this work. We do it because I am so focused on the work that I do. I think I saw an image once, and I've described it a few times on this podcast, of children and families being thrown over a bridge into water, and social workers down there catching them and with no life rafts. And it just says, trauma, behavioral health, and so forth. If we can just think about that image, rather than having, catching people when they're already falling, is how do we lift them up before they can even go over? And that's the image that I have in my head.
How do we fix the bridge?
How do we fix the bridge?
If they're falling through a broken bridge, and that's what this nation is in many ways, it's a broken bridge. If you fix the bridge, then we don't have to spend all our time pulling people out of the water who are drowning. So
I personally think rural communities are, I've done urban health. I think rural communities are perfectly positioned because we are small, and everyone says, well, everyone knows everyone. So let's leverage those relationships and start a new conversation. Dom and Katherine, any parting words before we show one more video? And then I just want to tell folks, you're going to be getting an email after this. You are going to get a free Anna Age 8 with some other resources if you are interested to have a local conversation, a local courageous conversation. Dom and Katherine and myself, we are happy to facilitate that either virtually or on site. We've had many conversations over these past few years. And instead of talking about it, let's take action. Parting words.
I can't wait to hear about your Anna Age 8 book club. It's such a beautiful, simple, life-changing step.
Katherine, what about you?
Well, yes, I agree with that. But also, I love to end with the vision of the bridge. Let's fix that bridge. This was an example we talked about in child welfare while we were working there. And I think we're at a critical moment in our society where we can really start fixing those bridges. We're seeing it happening, and let's do it. Why not?
We're all in. All right, folks. Stay on for just another minute or two. You're going to see a really powerful video. Dom and Katherine, as always, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm really appreciative that you joined us and that you were able to share the body of your work that is transforming the way rural counties in New Mexico are able to move forward with a new vision.
As we head out of Santa Fe, we have questions. Who decides the quality of our lives? Who survives? Who thrives?
As researchers and writers, we need to know what's really happening out there. We're on a mission in this era of uncertainty and have set out to discover how people fix a society that's failing so many.
We're in a race to meet amazing local problem solvers who don't take no for an answer. Join us on a road trip to meet the champions of New Mexico.